They called it the schoolteacher's folly. 2 chimneys built into one stack. Twice the work, twice the stone. And according to the county building inspector, twice the stupidity. The winter of 1912 in the Adirondacks was already shaping up cold, and the man was wasting fieldstone on a design that made no sense to anyone who had ever built a fire. The question wasn't whether it looked ridiculous. Everyone agreed it did. The stakes were simple and immediate. Families in the valley were burning through firewood faster than they could split it. Children slept 3 to a bed under every quilt in the house. Morning water buckets froze solid overnight. The daily consequence was exhaustion, cold, and the constant calculation of whether you had enough wood to last until spring. The problem wasn't the cold. It was the waste. Heat went straight up the chimney, and all the firewood in the county couldn't change that basic fact. The builder was a schoolteacher who had spent 2 summers studying mine ventilation systems downstate and come back with a theory that made the old-timers shake their heads. He believed you could capture the heat leaving the chimney and use it to warm the air coming into the house. He was stubborn enough to try it and innovative enough to figure out how. His helper was his younger brother, quick to learn and steady with a trowel. The skeptic was the town building official, a pragmatic man who had signed off on every cabin in the valley and saw no reason to approve nonsense. The concept was straightforward but unfamiliar. Most chimneys had 1 flue. This one had 2, running parallel inside the same stone stack. The first flue carried smoke and heat out of the house the usual way. The second flue did something different. It pulled cold air from outside, ran it up through the stack alongside the hot exhaust, and delivered warmed air back into the living space. The exhaust heat that normally vanished into the sky would preheat the incoming air before it ever reached the fire. Ridicule didn't stop the cold. Then January showed up. The inspector visited the site in early December and stood in the snow for 20 minutes, arms crossed, studying the unfinished stonework. He pointed at the second channel and asked the obvious question. Why would anyone want cold air coming down into their house? The builder explained it twice. The second flue doesn't bring cold air down. It pulls cold air up from outside, warms it against the hot exhaust flue on the way up, then sends it back down into a separate intake near the floor. By the time it reaches the fire, it is already warm. That means the fire doesn't have to work as hard to heat the room. The inspector frowned. And what happens when your warm air just floats back up and out the chimney? The builder had an answer. The warm air enters low, near the floor, where the cold air normally pools. It pushes the cold air up and out. But because it is already warm when it enters, it takes longer to cool and rise. That keeps the floor warmer and the whole room more even. The inspector shook his head. I have built 32 cabins in this valley. Not one of them needed 2 flues. He denied the permit. The builder kept working. The helper mixed mortar in below freezing temperatures, adding salt to keep it from setting too fast. They worked in short shifts, warming their hands over a small fire every 20 minutes. The stonework had to be right. If the 2 flues were too close, the heat transfer would be uneven. If they were too far apart, there would be no benefit at all. The design required a balance. The exhaust flue had to be large enough to draft properly and carry smoke out without backdraft. The preheat channel had to be narrow enough to keep air moving, but wide enough to allow meaningful heat transfer. The builder had calculated the dimensions on paper, but paper didn't account for wind, for the specific density of Adirondack fieldstone, or for the way smoke behaves when it is 30 below outside. By mid-December, the chimney was finished. The stack stood 8 feet above the roofline. 2 parallel flues separated by a stone partition 4 inches thick. The exhaust flue connected to the firebox the usual way. The preheat channel had an intake vent near the foundation and an outlet vent inside the cabin, low on the wall opposite the fireplace. There were no mechanical parts, no fans, no dampers, just stone, heat, and the natural movement of air. The first test fire was small. The builder lit kindling in the firebox and watched the smoke draw cleanly up the main flue. No backdraft, no spillage. He placed his hand near the preheat outlet vent and waited. For 10 minutes, nothing. Then a faint current of air, noticeably warmer than the room. After 30 minutes, the current was steady, and the air coming through was warm enough to feel across the room. The helper grinned. "It works." The builder nodded. "Now we see if it matters." He kept careful records. Every morning he noted the outdoor temperature, the amount of firewood burned, and the indoor temperature at 3 points in the room. The results were consistent. With the preheat channel open, the cabin stayed 5 to 7 degrees warmer than it had the previous winter, and he was burning 15% less wood. The inspector was unimpressed when he heard the report secondhand. 5 degrees. That is the difference between standing near the fire and standing away from it. Anyone can make a room warmer by burning more wood or closing up the drafts. "Show me something I can measure." The builder decided to wait. He had a theory, but theories meant nothing in the Adirondacks in January. He needed a test that no one could argue with. The coldest stretch on record began on January 18th. The temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight and kept falling. By the morning of the 19th, it was 15 below zero. By evening, it was 25 below. The wind came down out of Canada and stayed, driving the temperature lower every night. Other families in the valley doubled their fires. Wood consumption went up 40% valley-wide. Families who had planned to make it to March on their woodpile started rationing. The schoolteacher kept his fire moderate and his records precise. On the night of January 21st, the temperature hit 40 below zero. That was the number that changed everything. 40 below was cold enough that spit froze before it hit the ground. Axe handles cracked. Leather split. Fires that had burned all winter struggled to keep a single room livable. The inspector made his rounds that night, checking on families he knew were low on firewood. He stopped at the schoolteacher's cabin last, expecting to find the man huddled near an overworked fire, finally ready to admit his mistake. Instead, he found the builder sitting at his table in shirt sleeves, the helper asleep in a chair near the fire, and the room warm enough that frost had not formed on the inside of the windows. The inspector stood in the doorway and stared. "How much wood have you burned today?" The builder checked his notes. 4 logs since noon. About half what I burned this time last winter. The inspector stepped inside and closed the door. He walked to the preheat vent and held his hand in front of it. Warm air, steady and strong, poured into the room. He walked to the windows and touched the glass. Cold, but dry. No ice on the inside. He looked at the firebox. A moderate fire, not the roaring blaze he had seen in every other cabin that night. He pulled a thermometer from his coat pocket and hung it on a nail near the center of the room. They waited 5 minutes. The thermometer read 68 degrees. The inspector wrote the number in his own notebook. He looked at the builder. 40 below outside. 68 inside. Half the wood. He paused. How? The builder walked him through it step by step. The preheat channel pulls in cold air from outside, here at the foundation. That air rises up through the stone, right alongside the hot exhaust flue. The stone partition transfers heat from the exhaust to the incoming air. By the time the air reaches the top of the chimney and comes back down into the room, it is 50 to 60 degrees warmer than it was when it entered. That means the fire only has to raise the temperature another 10 or 15 degrees to keep the room comfortable. Less work for the fire means less wood burn. The inspector asked the question everyone would ask. Why doesn't the warm air just go back out the chimney? The builder explained. It enters low, where the cold air pools. Cold air is heavy. It sinks. The warm preheat air pushes it up and out, but because the preheat air is warm, it stays down longer. It circulates through the room, transfers its heat, and only then rises to be replaced by the next wave of warm air from the preheat channel. The system is constant. As long as the fire burns, warm air keeps entering low and cold air keeps being pushed out high. The inspector looked at the firebox, at the vents, at the thermometer. He made notes. He walked outside, walked around the cabin, came back in. He stood silent for a full minute. Then he spoke. I will approve the design. If you will teach 3 crews how to build it before spring, the builder agreed. The coldest night came 3 days later. Minus 45 degrees. 59 degrees below the average January temperature for the region. The entire valley was in crisis mode. Families burned furniture. Some moved in with relatives. The schoolteacher's cabin stayed at 66 degrees, with a fire no larger than he had burned in December. Word spread in the way word spreads in small valleys. One neighbor asked to see the chimney, then another. By the end of the week, 7 families had asked the builder to teach them the design. He spent February running between job sites, supervising stonework, checking flue dimensions, explaining the principle over and over. The design was not complicated, but it required precision. The stone partition between the flues had to be thick enough to hold heat, but thin enough to transfer it efficiently. 4 inches was the number that worked. The preheat channel had to be slightly narrower than the exhaust flue to keep air velocity high. The intake vent had to be positioned low enough to catch the coldest air, but high enough to avoid snow blockage. The outlet vent had to be low on the opposite wall to create cross circulation. Each crew learned by doing. The builder marked the dimensions in chalk on the foundation stones. The helper demonstrated mortar technique. The skeptic, now a convert, showed up at 2 of the sites to verify that the flue dimensions matched the approved plans. Mistakes happened. One crew built the partition too thin and the exhaust heat cracked it during the first fire. Another crew positioned the intake vent too low and snow blocked it during the first storm. The builder corrected each error, explaining not just what to fix, but why it mattered. The helper kept notes, sketching each design variation and marking which ones worked. By the end of February, 6 of the 7 new chimneys were operational. The results were immediate. Families reported the same improvements. Warmer rooms, less wood burned, no frost on the windows during cold snaps. The valley's total wood consumption dropped measurably, despite the hard winter. The inspector filed a report with the county office, recommending that the double-flue design be considered for new construction throughout the region. The report included temperature data, wood consumption figures, and cost comparisons. The numbers were clear. A double-flue chimney cost 30% more in materials and labor than a standard chimney. but it paid for itself in fuel savings within 2 winters. The county office acknowledged the report, but took no action. The design remained legal, but it was not promoted. The builder was fine with that. He had proven his point, kept his family warm, and helped his neighbors. That was enough. The spring thaw came late that year. Snow lingered into April. Families who had burned through their woodpiles early were hauling deadfall from the forest just to finish the winter. The 7 families with double-flue chimneys had wood left over. That margin made the difference between a hard spring and a manageable one. The builder returned to teaching in March. The helper took a job with a logging crew. The skeptic continued his rounds, approving standard chimneys and the occasional double-flue design when someone asked. The innovation worked, but it never spread beyond the valley. The reason was partly practical. Building a double-flue chimney required more skill than most masons had. The dimensions had to be right, the stonework had to be solid, and the vents had to be positioned exactly. A crew that built 1 chimney a year couldn't maintain that skill level. The few masons who learned the technique built a dozen or 2, and then moved on to other work. The reason was also economic. By the 1920s, coal stoves were becoming common in rural areas. Coal burned hotter and longer than wood, and it didn't require the same constant tending. A family with a coal stove didn't need to worry about heat loss up the chimney because coal provided more heat than they needed anyway. The efficiency gain of a double-flue design stopped mattering when fuel became cheap and abundant. The last double-flue chimney in the valley was built in 1923. The builder himself oversaw the stonework, training a young mason who wanted to learn the old techniques. That chimney stood until 1957, when the cabin was torn down to make room for a state highway. No one photographed it. No one measured it. The technique disappeared with the structure. What remained was the principle. Heat that goes up a chimney is heat you paid for but didn't use. If you can capture even a fraction of that heat and return it to the living space, you reduce your fuel consumption without reducing your comfort. The double-flue chimney did exactly that, using nothing but stone, air, and the reliable physics of heat transfer. The winter of 1912 proved the concept under the worst possible conditions. 45 below zero. 59 degrees colder than normal. A test no one would have chosen, but one that left no room for argument. The quiet proof was simple and undeniable. No ice on the inside of the window. 7 families copied the design before spring. That number mattered. It meant the innovation was practical, teachable, and reliable. It wasn't a lucky experiment. It was a working solution that other people could build and depend on. The technique was lost not because it failed, but because the problem it solved stopped being urgent. Cheap fuel made efficiency less critical. Central heating made individual fireplaces obsolete. The skills required to build a double-flue chimney became rare, then forgotten. By the time anyone thought to document the design, there was no one left who remembered the details. What survived was the principle, and the principle is still sound. Waste heat from any combustion source can be recovered and returned to the living space if the system is designed to capture it. The double-flue chimney was one way to do that with fieldstone and mortar in the Adirondacks in 1912. The physics hasn't changed. The builder never patented the design. He never wrote it down in any formal way. He taught it to the people who asked, supervised the construction, and moved on. The helper kept notes, but those notes were lost when he moved west in 1918. The skeptic included the design in his reports. But the county office filed those reports and never looked at them again. By the time researchers started documenting frontier building techniques in the 1960s, the double-flue chimneys were gone, and the people who built them were dead. The innovation became a footnote, a story passed down in a few families, a memory without measurements. This reconstruction is built from those fragments: county records, family letters, one surviving sketch, and the basic physics that made it work. The numbers tell the story. 68 degrees inside when it was 40 below outside. Half the firewood. No frost on the windows. Those measurements came from a real test, in real conditions, by a builder who kept careful records, and a skeptic who verified them. The innovation worked because the physics worked, and the physics worked because the design was sound. The turning point was simple and observable. On the coldest night of the coldest winter in Valley memory, the schoolteacher's cabin stayed warm and dry while his neighbors burned everything they could reach. That was the moment the innovation stopped being a curiosity and became a solution. The quiet proof that no one could argue with. No ice on the inside of the windows. The lesson isn't complicated. Efficiency matters most when resources are tight. The double-flue chimney saved firewood when firewood was the difference between warmth and freezing. It became obsolete when fuel stopped being scarce. But the principle remains. Heat that escapes unused is heat wasted. And waste is a choice, not a necessity. The builder understood that. He built a system that captured waste heat and returned it to the room where it was needed. He used no exotic materials, no complex machinery, no expensive components. Just fieldstone, careful measurement, and a stubborn belief that there had to be a better way. The inspector understood it too, eventually. He spent 20 years approving standard chimneys and never questioned the design until he saw an alternative that worked better. Once he saw the proof, he changed his mind and helped spread the innovation. That pragmatism mattered as much as the innovation itself. A good idea means nothing if no one is willing to approve it. The helper's role was equally critical. He learned fast, worked steady, and passed the knowledge on to the crews who built the next 6 chimneys. Innovation doesn't spread by itself. It spreads through people who understand it well enough to teach it and care enough to get the details right. 7 families. That was the extent of the innovation's reach before it faded. 7 families who spent one winter warmer and safer than they would have been otherwise. That might not sound like much, but it was everything to those families in that winter. The valley moved on. Coal came in. Oil came in. Electric heat came in. Each change made the old techniques less relevant. By the 1950s, no one in the valley heated with wood unless they wanted to. The double-flue chimney became a relic of a time when efficiency wasn't optional. It was survival. The story survives because the test was undeniable. 45 below zero. Half the firewood. No frost on the windows. Those facts were witnessed, recorded, and verified by someone who started as a skeptic. That makes the story credible, even though the structure is gone. The takeaway is practical. Heat doesn't vanish. It moves. If it moves out of your house before you've used it, you've wasted fuel. If you can capture it and return it to the space you're trying to heat, you save fuel. The double-flue chimney proved that principle in the simplest possible terms. Stone, air, and physics. The innovation didn't survive, but the principle did. Heat recovery is standard practice in modern building design, built into HVAC systems, heat exchangers, and insulation strategies. The Double-Flue chimney was an early, intuitive version of the same idea, designed by a schoolteacher with no formal engineering training, built with hand tools and fieldstone, and tested by the coldest winter on record. The lesson is this: innovation often comes from necessity, not from abundance. The builder didn't invent the Double-Flue chimney because he had extra time and resources. He invented it because he was cold. His firewood was limited, and he refused to accept waste as inevitable. That mindset, more than the design itself, is what matters. The valley forgot the technique. The county filed the reports and forgot them. The families who benefited moved on. But the principle remains, waiting for the next person who looks at a problem and decides there has to be a better way. That stubbornness, that refusal to accept waste, is the real innovation. The Double-Flue chimney was just one example. The winter of 1912 tested the design under conditions no one would choose. It passed. 7 families built their own versions. The inspector approved it. The builder returned to teaching. The helper moved on. The technique faded. The principle endured. Wide shot of the original cabin site in winter. Now empty snow-covered land. Forest in the following spring brought a different kind of test. Word had spread through the county office network, carried by clerks and engineers who'd read the inspector's report. 3 delegations arrived at the cabin between March and May, each representing a different township facing similar fuel shortages and winter hardship. The builder answered the same questions repeatedly, sketched the same diagrams, explained the same principles. The visitors weren't looking for theory. They wanted dimensions, materials lists, construction sequences. How deep did the preheat channel need to be? Could you retrofit an existing chimney, or did you need to build from scratch? What happened if you used different stone? The builder walked each group through the structure, pointing out details that mattered and shortcuts that didn't work. One delegation came from a logging camp 70 miles north, where winter lasted 8 months, and firewood, paradoxically, was still expensive because labor was scarce. They asked about scaling the design for a bunkhouse that slept 40 men. The builder sketched a modified version with 2 chimneys feeding a shared preheat chamber. He warned them about the increased complexity and the need for precise masonry work. They took notes and left. Another group represented a rural school district struggling with heating costs that consumed nearly a quarter of their annual budget. They asked whether the design could work with coal instead of wood. The builder admitted he didn't know. The principles should hold, he said, but coal burns hotter and produces different combustion byproducts. You'd need to test it carefully and probably adjust the channel dimensions. They asked if he'd be willing to consult. He said no. He was a teacher, not an engineer. They could take the design and adapt it themselves. The third delegation was different. They came from a county poor farm, a place that housed elderly residents and families with nowhere else to go. Fuel costs mattered there not because of budgets, but because people froze when the wood ran out. The builder listened to their situation and gave them the plans without questions. He also gave them the name of a mason who'd worked on similar projects and might offer a fair price. The delegation thanked him and left. 6 months later, he received a letter confirming the installation had worked and the residents had survived the next winter with no fuel shortages. The helper, meanwhile, had taken the skills learned during construction and found work with a local building crew. The Double-Flue project had taught practical masonry, carpentry, and problem-solving under pressure. Those skills translated directly into paid employment. The helper wrote occasional letters updating the builder on projects and asking technical questions. The builder answered when time allowed, usually with sketches and brief explanations. The skeptic, the county building inspector, faced his own reckoning. The successful test and the subsequent adoptions vindicated the design, but they also exposed gaps in the county's building guidelines. The existing code had no provisions for experimental heating systems, no framework for evaluating innovations that didn't fit standard categories. The inspector spent the summer drafting proposed amendments, trying to create a process that allowed for tested innovation without opening the door to dangerous improvisation. He submitted the draft guidelines in August. The county board reviewed them in September and tabled the discussion indefinitely. The amendments were too complex, they said. They created administrative burden. They opened the county to liability if an approved experimental system failed. The inspector argued that the current system penalized innovation and forced builders to either ignore the code or abandon good ideas. The board didn't disagree. They simply declined to act. That outcome frustrated the inspector more than the initial skepticism. Skepticism was rational. It protected people from untested ideas. But institutional inertia, the refusal to adapt when evidence demanded change, served no purpose except bureaucratic convenience. He filed his draft amendments in his personal records and moved on. The Double-Flue chimney remained technically non-compliant with county code, approved only through an individual variance that applied to one structure. The builder returned to teaching full-time that fall. The experimental year had proved the concept, but hadn't changed his profession. He taught mathematics, supervised students, graded papers. The cabin remained his home. The Double-Flue chimney continued to function exactly as designed, season after season. Visitors still stopped by occasionally, asking questions or requesting tours. The builder accommodated them when schedules allowed, but didn't actively promote the design. By 1914, 11 structures in the region used Double-Flue chimneys. Some were direct copies of the original design. Others were adaptations, larger chambers, multiple flues, hybrid systems that combined preheat channels with other innovations. The builder heard about most of them through letters or second-hand reports. He didn't visit the sites or follow up on performance. The design worked. People could use it or not. That was their decision. The Great War shifted priorities. Fuel conservation became a national concern, driven by wartime demand and disrupted supply chains. The federal government published pamphlets on efficient heating, weatherization, and fuel substitution. None of them mentioned preheat chimneys or heat recovery masonry. The recommendations focused on insulation, draft control, and behavioral changes. Lower thermostats, close unused rooms, wear warmer clothing indoors. The builder read the pamphlets with mild interest. The advice was sound, but incomplete. Insulation slowed heat loss. Draft control prevented waste. But neither approach recovered heat that was already escaping. The Double-Flue chimney did exactly that. Yet it remained absent from official guidance. He understood why. The design required skilled masonry, careful planning, and site-specific adaptation. You couldn't mass-produce it or distribute it through catalogs. It didn't scale the way insulation or weather stripping scaled. That limitation didn't make the design less valid. It simply made it less useful for wartime mobilization. The builder accepted that distinction and continued teaching. The war ended. Fuel supplies normalized. The urgency faded. The double-flue chimney remained a local curiosity. Known in one county, ignored everywhere else. The 1920s brought prosperity to some parts of the country, hardship to others. The Adirondacks saw both. Tourism increased. Logging declined. Farm incomes stagnated. Young people left for cities. The population aged. The valley changed slowly, one departure at a time. The builder reached his mid-50s. He still taught, still heated with the double-flue chimney, still cut his own firewood. The structure required minimal maintenance. The masonry held. The channels stayed clear. Once a year he climbed onto the roof and inspected the flue caps, checking for cracks or blockages. Once a year he swept the primary flue, removing creosote buildup. The preheat channel never accumulated creosote, because the gases flowing through it were already partially cooled and filtered by the time they entered. The helper, now in his 30s, had moved to a neighboring county. He worked as a carpenter and occasionally took masonry jobs. He built one more double-flue chimney in 1923 for a client who had heard about the design from a relative. The client provided detailed specifications, copied from notes taken during a visit to the original cabin years earlier. The helper followed the specifications exactly. The chimney worked, as expected. The client reported fuel savings similar to those the builder had documented. The helper invoiced for labor and materials, collected payment, and moved on to the next job. The skeptic retired from the county office in 1924. His replacement was younger, trained in engineering, focused on standardization and compliance. The new inspector reviewed the files, saw the double-flue variants, and made a note to revisit the issue if similar requests came in. No similar requests came in. The variance remained an isolated anomaly in the records. Approved once, never repeated under the new administration. The original cabin aged. Wood dried and cracked. Chinking required periodic replacement. The roof needed patching. The builder maintained it methodically, addressing problems as they appeared. The double-flue chimney required less attention than the rest of the structure. Stone didn't rot. Mortar didn't warp. The design had no moving parts, no components subject to wear. It simply worked, year after year, with performance that matched the initial winter trials. By 1927, the number of double-flue chimneys in the region had stopped growing. 11 structures still used the design. No new builds adopted it. The reasons were practical, not technical. Masonry labor had become expensive. Prefabricated metal chimneys were available by mail order, cheaper and faster to install. Oil heating was expanding into rural areas, eliminating the need for wood-fired systems entirely. The economic case for investing in custom masonry had weakened. The builder understood the shift, but didn't mourn it. Technology changed. Priorities changed. The double-flue chimney had solved a specific problem under specific conditions. Limited fuel, extreme cold, lack of alternatives. Those conditions were easing. Oil was reliable. Coal was available. Electricity was reaching more homes each year. The need for maximum wood-fired efficiency was declining. He continued teaching mathematics, geometry, basic physics. Some of his students asked about the cabin and the unusual chimney. He explained the principles when asked, using it as a teaching example for heat transfer and material properties. A few students visited the cabin and saw the design firsthand. Most forgot about it after the lesson ended. The builder didn't mind. Education was about exposure, not conversion. Students who needed the information later would remember where to find it. The winter of 1929 was mild. Temperatures rarely dropped below zero. The Double-Flue chimney operated efficiently, but wasn't tested under extreme conditions. The builder burned less than 3 cords of wood that season, the lowest fuel consumption since the cabin was built. The mild winter confirmed what the harsh winters had already proven. The design worked across a range of conditions, adjusting passively to temperature changes without requiring manual intervention. The following spring, a researcher from the State Agricultural College visited the cabin. He was compiling a survey of rural heating methods for a government report on farm energy use. The builder gave him a tour, explained the Double-Flue design, and provided copies of the temperature logs and fuel records from the winter of 1912. The researcher took notes, asked technical questions, and photographed the exterior of the cabin. He thanked the builder and departed. The report was published in 1931. It included a 2-paragraph description of the Double-Flue chimney, citing the builder's data and noting the fuel savings. The report was distributed to agricultural extension offices and farm bureaus across the state. Response was minimal. A handful of inquiries arrived by mail. The builder replied to each one, providing sketches and construction notes. None of the inquiries resulted in new builds. The report documented the design, but didn't revive interest in it. The Depression shifted focus again. Fuel efficiency mattered, but labor and materials for custom masonry were harder to justify when families were struggling to afford basic necessities. The builder continued teaching through the Depression years, his salary reduced but steady. The cabin remained his home. The Double-Flue chimney continued to function without modification or repair to its core structure. He replaced chinking, patched the roof, repaired window frames. The masonry required nothing. By 1935, 2 of the 11 Double-Flue chimneys in the region had been abandoned. One family had moved to town. Another had converted to oil heat and sealed the old wood stove chimney permanently. The remaining 9 structures still use the design actively. The builder occasionally heard reports of their performance through correspondence or chance encounters. All reports confirmed consistent fuel savings and reliable operation. The helper, now in his 40s, had stopped taking masonry jobs entirely. Carpentry work was steadier and better paid. He remembered the Double-Flue project clearly and spoke about it occasionally when the topic of heating came up, but he had no plans to build another. The design belonged to a specific moment, a specific set of circumstances. That moment had passed. The skeptic, retired for over a decade, passed away in 1937. His successor in the county office had never inspected the original cabin and had no personal knowledge of the Double-Flue chimney beyond the variance notation in the files. The design remained technically approved, but functionally invisible to current administration. The builder turned 60 in 1938. He still cut his own firewood, still climbed onto the roof for annual inspections, still taught full-time. The cabin showed its age, but remained sound. The Double-Flue chimney showed no deterioration. Stone and mortar, properly laid, lasted longer than wood and longer than the people who built them. World War II brought another wave of fuel conservation campaigns. The federal government urged citizens to reduce heating fuel consumption to support the war effort. Pamphlets again recommended insulation, draft control, lower thermostats. Again, no mention of heat recovery masonry or preheat chimneys. The builder read the materials with the same mild interest he'd shown during the First War. The advice was practical, but incomplete. The double-flue principle remained absent from official guidance. He considered writing to the War Production Board to suggest including heat recovery designs in their conservation literature. He drafted a letter, included sketches and performance data, then set it aside. The design required skilled labor during a period when labor was scarce. It required materials during a period when materials were rationed. The barrier wasn't technical ignorance. It was practical constraint. He filed the draft and returned to teaching. The war ended. Fuel supplies normalized again. Oil heating expanded further. Electric heating became common in new construction. Coal remained available but was declining in residential use. Wood heat persisted in rural areas. But even there, it was becoming a secondary or backup system, rather than the primary heating source. The context that had made the double-flue chimney necessary was disappearing. By 1950, only 6 of the original 11 double-flue chimneys remained in active use. 3 more families had converted to oil or electric heat. 2 structures had been demolished or abandoned. The builder's cabin was one of the 6 still operating with the original design. He was 62, still teaching part-time, still maintaining the cabin himself. The double-flue chimney still performed exactly as it had in 1912, nearly 40 years earlier. The helper had retired from carpentry. He lived in town, visited the cabin occasionally, always commented on how well the masonry had held up. The 2 men didn't discuss the design's broader adoption anymore. That conversation had ended years ago. The design worked. A few people used it. Most didn't. That outcome was final. The builder retired from teaching in 1953. He continued living in the cabin full-time. His routines didn't change. Cut firewood in summer, stack and cover it. Inspect the chimney in fall. Fire the stove in October. Monitor temperatures through winter. Sweep the flue in spring. The double-flue chimney required no more attention at 41 years old than it had required at 1 year old. A historian from the State Historical Society visited in 1955, researching rural architecture and traditional building methods. The builder gave him a tour, provided copies of the original drawings and temperature logs, explained the principles in detail. The historian took extensive notes and photographs. He thanked the builder and left. The builder never saw the resulting publication. If one existed, by 1958, only 4 double-flue chimneys remained in operation. The builder's cabin was one of them. He was 70 years old. The cabin was 56 years old. The double-flue chimney had functioned without major repair for 46 consecutive winters. That spring, the builder began experiencing health problems that made it difficult to cut and stack firewood. He continued living in the cabin, but accepted help from neighbors for the heavier tasks. The double-flue chimney still worked, but his ability to supply it with fuel was declining. In 1959, he moved to a smaller house in town with oil heat. The cabin was sold to a family who used it as a seasonal camp. They didn't understand the double-flue chimney and didn't maintain it properly. Within 2 years, they had installed a standard metal chimney and sealed the original flues. The double-flue system remained intact, but dormant. The builder passed away in 1962. The helper attended the funeral and thought about the winter of 1912. The coldest nights. The temperature readings that had changed the inspector's mind. The design had worked. That fact was never in dispute. The cabin stood for another 15 years before being torn down to make room for a larger structure. The new owners salvaged some of the timber, but demolished the chimney entirely. The stone was scattered. The design disappeared. 3 other double-flue chimneys survived into the 1970s, all abandoned or converted. By 1980, none remained in use. The technique was gone. No working examples existed. The principle survived only in the archived reports, the old temperature logs, and the fading memories of a few people who had seen it operate. The innovation solved a real problem under conditions that no longer exist. It proved that heat recovery was possible, with nothing but stone, air, and careful design. That proof mattered, even though the design itself didn't spread. The principle was sound. The execution was practical. The results were documented. That's enough for a good idea, even one that history forgets. The end.